It's a region that has been at war for more than 70 years. Kashmir, a place rich in culture and tradition. Home to Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Sikhs. A state which has for decades fermented hate and fanaticism, driving apart two countries who were once one.
Kashmir is usually portrayed as a beautiful woman who is stuck between these brute nations of India and Pakistan.
The fact is that India and Pakistan will never be settled neighbors.
Each nation secretly seeks to assert its control over the region. But with every clandestine confrontation, the stakes get higher.
You keep your fingers crossed, you're nervous, because what if it goes out of control? What if they deploy nuclear weapons?
Caught in the middle, the Kashmiri people. On the 5th of August 2019, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi revoked Kashmir's special status in India's constitution, taking away its autonomy. Bitterly opposed to anyone else running their affairs, thousands of Kashmiris take to the streets. The retribution from India is swift. Prime Minister Narendra Modi orders his soldiers to take control, arresting anyone who gets in their way. How was Modi able to secretly seize one of South Asia's most contentious territories? What dark deals have been done by world leaders to prolong the conflict in Kashmir? India was the jewel of the British Empire. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, Britain's treasury was depleted. India was a prize Britain could no longer afford.
At the end of the Second World War, Britain was absolutely bankrupt for fairly obvious reasons, and yet it was holding on to a major empire across the world. And the Labour government decided we have to give India independence as soon as possible. And Mountbatten, who was the last Viceroy of India, actually did a pretty quick job. And Mountbatten simply said, we are leaving in 1947. And that was a sort of shock treatment that all of the parties who were vying for power in post-independence India would have to get their act together pretty quickly.
India's political leaders were deeply divided along religious lines. Muslims and Hindus started attacking each other as the British withdrew. On the 14th of August 1947, the Muslim-majority nation of Pakistan was formed under its founder and first president, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The Hindu-majority nation of India followed a day later, under its first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru.
The conflict between India and Pakistan goes back to 1947. Partition was a sudden and fairly brutal process. And the problem was that Kashmir, which is both Muslim and Hindu, was made into a special status territory, both for Pakistan and for India, and it was never reconciled to either of them.
This hurriedly decided partition, with little thought to the region's history and culture, became a grim reality. More than 15 million people were forced to abandon their homes as religious groups who had coexisted for generations turned on each other.
It left a great mess in Kashmir, and the intercommunal violence that took place certainly involved millions of people and hundreds of thousands of deaths, some say millions of deaths, in the chaos that followed.
As the region was divided in two, civil unrest broke out in the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir.
At the time of Indian-Pakistani independence from British rule, Jammu and Kashmir wasn't under direct administration of the British Empire, so the princely states were given the option of essentially joining either India or Pakistan, depending on contiguity and demographics. Kashmir in particular provided a quite complicated case, given that it was contiguous to both India and Pakistan and had a Hindu ruler but a Muslim majority population.
At the time of partition, Kashmir was ruled by the Sikh ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh. Caught between two powerful nations, he stalled for time. India's political leader, Jawaharlal Nehru, had Kashmiri roots. Like many Hindus, he and Mahatma Gandhi saw the region as a key part of modern India. But Muslim veterans, newly returned to Kashmir after fighting for Britain in World War II, wanted to take their homeland into Pakistan. Facing repeated uprisings and unrest from both sides, in 1947, Maharaja Singh signed the Instrument of Accession, also known as Article 370. This gave India sovereignty over Kashmir.
The two versions to it. One was that he voluntarily signed an instrument of accession with India. The other is he was forced to sign an instrument of accession. But whatever way you look at it, the result was that the instrument of accession allowed Indian troops to come in to force their way into Kashmir Valley and fight.
That instrument of accession does not give India an unconditional right to Kashmir. It has certain restrictions. Those restrictions being that India can only make law on defense, communications, and foreign affairs.
It would later be revealed that Pakistan had been supplying the Kashmiri Muslims with weapons.
There was an underneath war which was being planned without knowledge of the commanders at the top who were British. What Pakistani officers did was put together this small group of tribal warriors and pack them off to Kashmir to fight.
Thousands of people fled into refugee camps on both sides of the border.
India went to the UN asking that Pakistan be stopped. And that's the beginning of the first two resolutions at the United Nations on Kashmir, which got UN involved in the Kashmir conflict.
A ceasefire line was agreed, splitting Kashmir in two. 65% remained under India's control. 35% was now part of Pakistan.
At the time, the provisions of the UN Security Council resolutions did not make a provision for sort of Kashmiri independence, which was one of the desires of the people, at least within the Kashmir Valley, if not the broader region.
In 1972, the ceasefire line was reclassified as the formal line of control, the de facto border of Kashmir to this day.
There is a line of control across Kashmir, which is a relatively narrow territory, and that line of control varies according to the route of rivers. And in any given winter, the rivers will change their routes and the line of control moves north a bit and south a bit and causes immense tension between the peoples who live either side of that line of control.
Even as this border was being agreed, both India and Pakistan's military were secretly starting to undermine it. Bigger battles were yet to come between these fierce and ultimately nuclear rivals.
This line of control is one of the most densely militarized zones in the world, where you have two armies of two very populous nations staring down each other.
After partition, India inherited the bureaucracy left by the British. It had a centrally functioning government through which it could assert its control over Kashmir. Pakistan, by contrast, suffered from a weak economy. Slowly, it forged an identity based upon the supremacy of its military. In 1958, the General Muhammad Ayub Khan seized power in a military coup.
Our people were frustrated. They felt that it was a perfectly good people, good country being ruined, perhaps by the people who were responsible for running the country or the system.
How Pakistan military became important goes back to 1947-48, the first war between India and Pakistan. That started it all. Pakistan turned into a national security state. There was all this propaganda about how India was his big enemy, which made Pakistan military extremely important.
With popular public support and new powerful Western allies, Ayub Khan and his generals believed they now had the strength to win back Kashmir.
The US is one of the first countries to recognize Pakistan as an independent state and has a very close relationship with it. The fact that Pakistan's neighbor India is allied to the Soviet Union means within the Cold War, Pakistan is seen as a key ally to the United States.
Pakistan had gotten stronger, it had got American aid, so there was military modernization, it could take on India, so there was a lot of confidence there.
By the 1960s, freshly supplied with US tanks and artillery, Pakistan decided to act over Kashmir. In August 1965, it launched a covert mission classified as Operation Gibraltar.
What we see in 1965, a plan executed whereby Pakistani military dropped its troops behind enemy lines, which is across the line of control on the Indian side in Kashmir, with the hope that these troops would encourage local Kashmiris to rise up against and fight the Indian military. The plan didn't work, but it then provoked India to respond. So they were not just fighting Pakistani troops, they were fighting local Kashmiris as well. And so that was beginning of local involvement in Kashmir of paramilitary and military by India.
India responded to this covert action carried out by Pakistani troops by crossing the ceasefire line and attacking Lahore in Pakistan. Amid heavy fighting, the USA and USSR used diplomatic means to persuade both armies to fall back to the ceasefire line. In 1969, General Ayub Khan resigned as Pakistan's Prime Minister. But Operation Gibraltar was to have a lasting legacy on his country's foreign policy. The military propaganda machine rewrote the covert invasion of Kashmir as a success for Pakistan. Over time, it began to believe its own fiction. India's military also claimed victory, but the government in New Delhi was shaken. Pakistan's secret paramilitary forces had infiltrated Kashmir without their knowledge. India's Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, sought another way to weaken Pakistan. During partition in 1947, the British cut the state of Bengal in two, giving half of the region to Pakistan. This was despite its geographical position at the opposite end of the Himalayas.
Indira Gandhi addressed the biggest vulnerability in Pakistan's architecture, which was it had two wings, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, separated by 1,000 miles of enemy territory, which is India. I mean, it's unimaginable, that kind of a country.
By 1970, separatist movements in East Pakistan were keen to break away from Islamabad and form their own independent state.
In 1970s, Bengalis were more than all the Pakistanis put together in West Pakistan, and they wanted acceptance of their own identity.
Prime Minister Indira Gandhi encouraged these breakaway groups, secretly supplying Bengali fighters with weapons, intelligence, and money.
For the sake of India's security and Indian nationalism, if East Pakistan became a separate country, they could deal with it separately. And East Pakistan would always be weaker as a separate country than as part of Pakistan.
In March 1971, voters in East Pakistan elected the separatist leaders who would push West Pakistan to recognize Bengali rights.
The real reason for the uprising in East Pakistan was that they thought they were being exploited. A lot of lies that are told. But the fact is that these lies were used by the military to very harshly deal with people who were basically demanding their rights.
Pakistan's new Prime Minister, Zulfikar Bhutto, fearing his country was about to split in two, launched a brutal crackdown. As the Pakistan military cracked down on Bengalis, India was drawn further into the conflict. Millions of refugees crossed its borders. Indira Gandhi appealed to world leaders to intervene to stop the bloodshed, while continuing her support for Bengali separatists. She hoped that the international community would grant the Bengalis independence from Pakistan. Kashmir, however, was a different story.
All the things that Indira Gandhi said about the right of Muslims to be Muslim in the new Bangladesh didn't extend to Kashmir. And the Indians have always had this really strong sense that Kashmir should have been Indian from the start in 1947, that this is a historic injustice that they lay at the feet of the British, and that they must do all they can to change it.
In December 1971, in a bid to put a stop to India's interference in Bengal, Pakistan launched a series of airstrikes against Indian air bases in Kashmir. India responded with force. Its army captured some 90,000 Pakistani troops in eastern Pakistan. In one of the shortest wars in history, only 13 days, this represented a comprehensive and humiliating defeat for Bhutto's government. On the 16th of December, 1971, eastern Pakistan became the new sovereign state of Bangladesh.
It marked quite an existential crisis for Pakistan, essentially losing a significant chunk of its territory with a significant chunk of population. But apart from that issue, it created a significant crisis in terms of just the identity of Pakistan as a home for South Asian Muslims, which was the basis behind its creation.
Bhutto was to pay the ultimate price for Pakistan's defeat. In 1977, the president was overthrown in a military coup and executed by the generals who usurped his power. Since India refused to negotiate over Kashmir's future, Bhutto's successor, General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, courted international allies in the hope of expanding his regime's influence.
Pakistan has also always played the United States here, really. They've known how to get what they want from the US. They've known how to draw maximum military aid, how to exploit their position in that region as something that the United States needs to use for their own national security goals, while at the same time remaining very true to their own goals and interests.
Zia consolidated his power by introducing a radical new agenda of Islamization into his country. Pakistan's defeat in Kashmir was reframed by hardline Islamic preachers as a jihadist struggle, which was gaining momentum. But they needed weapons and warriors to wage their holy war. In December 1979, in the shadow of the Cold War, Zia found a way to provide both. Soviet troops invaded Pakistan's neighbor, Afghanistan, in an attempt to bolster the communist government in Kabul. Resistance from Afghan warlords was swift, and Zia allowed Muslim Mujahideen forces to establish training camps in the north of his country. He instructed Pakistan's secretive spy division, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, or ISI, to support the Taliban. One man who would receive this support was Osama bin Laden. During the last years of the Cold War, by helping thwart the Soviet army in Afghanistan, Pakistan became the third largest recipient of American military aid.
The United States was too far away and too uncommitted to come and directly fight a war in Afghanistan.
India and Pakistan both became subject to the geopolitical games of the Cold War.
In the 1980s, under the military dictatorship of Zaire, become extremely relevant, especially as Pakistan becomes a hub through which the United States launches one of its largest and most significant covert operations, the CIA-sponsored opposition to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
As Pakistan's access to military aid increased, Indira Gandhi's government sought to curb Islamabad's resurgence by building a relationship with the USSR.
India sided, in effect, with the Soviet Union. It got its weapons from the Soviet Union. It used its relationship with the Soviet Union to prove that it wasn't just a puppet of the United States and the West. And that policy locked India into some pretty strong Cold War stances. And that resulted, of course, in the West, and particularly the United States, backing Pakistan even more strongly.
In 1980, India became one of the world's largest arms importer, and Moscow was its purse. The Soviets provided a $1.6 billion loan for military purchases. Both countries now entered a secretive arms race, one which would take the world to the brink of nuclear war. By 1989, after years of fierce fighting in the cold mountains of Afghanistan, the Soviet army finally admitted defeat to the Mujahideen. Abandoning the communist government they had propped up in Kabul, the Soviets withdrew and the Taliban took charge.
Through the 1990s, it begins to become more murky and more complex. Pakistan and the border region becomes a hub for non-state terrorist groups. And the FBI and the CIA begin to recognize this as a new area of an emergent Sunni jihadi terrorist threat.
General Zia's regime had secretly been using America's money to fund Islamist terror cells across South Asia. In August 1988, a plane carrying General Zia-ul-Haq crashed. Everyone on board was killed. With Zia's death, a power vacuum opened up, something the more radical elements of Pakistani society were keen to exploit.
There were other militant groups from Pakistan who had fought in Afghanistan, who were battle-hardened, and some of these militants actually then made their way into the Kashmir Valley.
The late 1980s was a critical period in changing the nature of the conflict in Jammu and Kashmir. In 1987, there were elections in India, and the elections were widely seen as rigged within Jammu and Kashmir. This led to significant unrest. It was sort of the trigger for the insurgency that continued for several years and continues until now, and led to the formation of more hardline militant organizations in the Kashmir Valley.
Indian troops were unable to distinguish between radical Islamic fighters and Kashmiri villagers, angry at their continued denial of independence.
The Indian government claim that Kashmiri separatists, Muslim separatists, operate in the south and create a lot of social division and commit acts of terrorism. And Pakistan claims that India constantly tries to push the line of control and is constantly looking at the possible conquest of the Pakistani area, the northern part of the Kashmir territories.
As violent clashes unfolded, India and Pakistan were pursuing potent military power on another scale. As Pakistan pursued enriched uranium, India secretly sought its own nuclear weapon. Codenamed Smiling Buddha, the device was one of Indira Gandhi's best-kept secrets. Only a handful of generals knew of its development. On the 18th of May, 1974, India shocked the world by successfully testing Smiling Buddha.
What 1974 Indian nuclear test did, it drew international attention. It was, as India claimed, a peaceful nuclear program, but also a signal to the world that India had acquired the potential to go atomic, and therefore should not be taken lightly.
India had exploded a bomb in 1974, but it was a peaceful nuclear explosion, according to the Indians, and they didn't do anything else after that. But in 1998, Pakistan tested a weapon, India tested a weapon, and they both joined the nuclear club.
There were new stakes to be considered on the border skirmishes in Kashmir.
So since then, we have an inherently stable border situation between two powers who are geopolitically opposed in South Asia, who are religiously opposed, and who are both nuclear powers.
As both nations revealed their nuclear capability, in Kashmir, the Islamist insurgency ramped up the pressure on India. In August 1999, Indian and Pakistani troops exchanged artillery fire across the line of control.
The costs of India moving into Pakistani territory were seen to be extremely high, and Indian troops, in spite of suffering a lot of attrition, a lot of casualties, did not cross the line of control for fear of nuclear escalation.
Indian troops patrolling the Kashmiri mountains that summer found the positions they had previously held were now occupied. Pakistani fighters had once again secretly invaded Kashmir. In some places, insurgent units had infiltrated more than 10 kilometers into Indian-controlled Kashmir. India maintained that these terrorists were financed and trained by Pakistan. Pakistan denied this, however, adamantly insisting the troops were Kashmiri freedom fighters, deserving of moral support.
Every skirmish has become more intense than the previous one.
The United States' primary goal has been to try to prevent a war in that region. They see a conflict in that region as potentially catastrophic.
In the case of Pakistan, with a great deal of internal dissension, a great deal of civil unrest, it is not even clear to the rest of the world that Pakistan's nuclear weapons are safely under control. There is a great sense of impending world crisis between India and Pakistan.
We are working very closely with the United States and indeed with other members of the Security Council to do everything we can to avert the risk of serious conflict. This is a conflict between two independent nations, large independent nations, India and Pakistan, and it can only be resolved bilaterally.
Their position is that it needs to be mediated between those two governments, that they need to find their own solution. But they've never really been able to successfully play a peacemaker role there, despite, on occasions, personal interventions on the part of presidents.
It is also critical to note that there is no bilateral crisis management mechanism between India and Pakistan. So the United States, in particular, as well as sort of the United Kingdom and some other international actors, play a very important role.
In Kashmir, suicide bombings of army stations, followed by brutal crackdowns on rural populations, continued through the 1990s. But Pakistan's confidence that it could continue to back Islamic groups in the region, whilst keeping America on their side, was about to be tested to the limit. Following the September 11th terrorist attacks in New York in 2001, Washington substantially shifted its relationship with Islamabad.
So this combination of souring relations over their closeness to the Taliban, their funding of the Taliban, their protection of Osama bin Laden, and their persistent development of nuclear weapons means that by the time 9/11 occurs, relations between these two countries are very tense and quite dysfunctional.
No longer a Cold War ally, the Pakistani government found itself branded a friend of terrorists. Something it was forced to confront again when those same fighters took their fight to India. On September the 20th, 2001, 9 days after the attacks on the World Trade Center, the United States government declared a war on terrorism.
They will be stopped, and they will be punished.
The message was very clear. You are either with us or with the terrorists. This new war placed Pakistan in the dilemma of either continuing to support the Taliban or disavow them, and also disengaging from its geopolitical interest in Afghanistan and Kashmir, both considered vital to its national security. President Musharraf assumed a deceitful position that ended up breaking Washington's trust. He declared his unconditional support for the war on terrorism, but continued to provide aid to Kashmiri separatist and Muslim guerrillas. For the CIA, the Pakistani Intelligence Bureau continues to support and promote terrorism in the name of Pakistan's geostrategic interests, helping its ruling elite and destabilizing its enemies by supporting Sunni Islamists in the region.
The militant groups really changed the battle lines in Kashmir. Instead of that being a political movement, it became a militant movement.
Fearful of losing more US support, the Pakistan government, led by President Pervez Musharraf, had taken steps to curb the extremist Islamic terror networks. The Islamic militant groups who had contributed to the bloodshed in Kashmir started attacking targets in Pakistan. The nation became an active player in the war against terrorism. The Taliban guerrillas intensified military operations in territories to the south and north. The actions led to an undeclared armed conflict against the Pakistani army. The failure of the military operations and the escalation of the clashes in 2004 and 2005 further complicated the relations between Pakistan and the United States. America blamed Musharraf for the advances of the Taliban in the southern provinces, despite the large amount of aid received. In 2006, India's government responded by redeploying thousands of troops away from the line of control.
President Musharraf and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh came up with a formula to move towards a resolution. However, this process stalled at sort of later stages when it moved towards details and towards more thorny issues.
Still, when a train was bombed by Kashmiri separatists in February 2007, India chose a policy of restraint. These tentative steps towards peace were only rewarded with more bloodshed. On November the 26th, 2008, armed gunmen from the Islamic terrorist group Lashkar-e-Taiba attacked Mumbai, and in particular, the jewel in its crown, the world-renowned and opulent Taj Mahal Palace Hotel.
Mumbai attacks were very different in their constitution. It was no longer a battle fought on the line of control or in Kashmir. It was a fight which had been taken into the streets of India, killing hundreds of people, innocent people, people who were not expecting such an attack to happen. It really shook the imagination of Indian people and generated an anger, a spirit of anger.
India claimed that the terror group were a direct proxy of the Pakistani State Intelligence Service, the feared ISI. Pakistan denied the accusations. In 2011, the already deteriorated relations between the United States and Pakistan reached their lowest point when the US launched an operation to kill Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad. For many in the Pakistani military, this was a bridge too far. It meant an unacceptable violation of its national sovereignty. In 2014, voters swept the Hindu nationalist Narendra Modi to power. His BJP party began to pursue a nationalist agenda.
One of its founding fathers had argued that in one country you cannot have two constitutions and two leaders and two flags.
Indian Prime Minister now has taken a very assertive view on Kashmir.
Modi's government ordered artillery bombardments along the line of control in response to attacks on civilian and military targets. Thousands of Kashmiris start to protest against their treatment. As the world refrains from getting involved, technology has brought the daily battles in Kashmir to a larger partisan audience. In July 2018, Imran Khan claims to have won the elections in Pakistan and gives a reckless warning.
मैं नरेंद्र मोदी को यहां से आज पैगाम देता हूं कि आप एक्शन लें, आपकी ईंट का जवाब पत्थर से दिया जाएगा.
If the world does nothing to stop the Indian assault on Kashmir and its people, two nuclear-armed states will come closer to a direct military confrontation. Both sides repeatedly interfere with mainstream media outlets, ensuring their people see the conflict through their specific nationalistic prism. In 2019, seeking re-election, Indian Prime Minister Modi seeks to capitalize on the reach of social media. His party, BJP, sent messages to millions of people claiming that Modi was going to revoke Kashmir's special status and open up the state to Hindus from across India.
He also uses social media extremely well as conventional media, in terms of who he engages with selectively to make sure he reaches his audience.
Hindus no longer view the suicide bombings in Kashmir as a local insurgency against the region's local elites. The aftermath of each attack is frequently shared to people's phones. So, Modi has made each bombing feel like an attack on all of modern India.
The Indian response of the airstrike in Balakot in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan gave him a significant boost in terms of his image as being a strong nationalist leader. This is something that aligned with the aspiration of India as a growing international actor and growing in importance as a geopolitical actor.
Modi wins elections on the 23rd of May, 2019. In August, his troops take control in Kashmir. The first thing to go, Kashmir's special status in India's constitution.
Article 370, when read with Article 35A, implies that only Kashmiris can buy land in Kashmir. It implies that only Kashmiris are eligible for certain employment, for certain jobs in Kashmir. It gives these protections to the people of Kashmir. So what the government of India has done on August 5, 2019 is basically they have amended Article 370 without following the procedure that was agreed upon by Kashmir and by India. So in effect, they have violated the international treaty. They have violated the instrument of accession.
Modi's recent actions in Kashmir are inspired not just by the lessons which India has learned in the course of 71 years of conflict over Kashmir, but really his Hindutva ideology. It's more to do with the kind of India that Modi wants to produce, a majoritarian rule where there's very little room for Kashmiris asking for independence or for exercising their choice to perhaps go and join Pakistan or even autonomy.
No longer America's cozy Cold War ally, Pakistan could only protest. In Britain, both British Pakistanis and Hindus have lobbied Parliament on Kashmir. Security experts have warned of possible radicalization in the UK. Still, little has been done. Neither India nor Pakistan seems willing to give up their claim to sovereignty over Kashmir.
The option which Modi has given to Pakistan, he has given an option to Kashmiris, which is that lay down your arms, become integrated into India, stop your movements. The signal to Pakistan is, I'm drawing a line here. If you want to use military, by all means, then I'm going to fight back.
So the only question that needs to be asked is whether the people who are living on the other side of the line of control, the side that India calls Pakistan occupied Kashmir and Pakistan calls Azad Kashmir, which means free Kashmir. The only question that needs to be asked about that area is not whether India wants to recapture it or not, but whether the people living in that area want to merge with India or not.
Many international actors have tried to broker a deal on Kashmir, and the obvious deal is staring everyone in the face, which is that southern Kashmir is intrinsically Indian and northern Kashmir is intrinsically Pakistani, and the populations will get used to that idea, even though they're intercommunal. That's the solution.
A simple solution on paper. But after decades of conflict, Kashmir still remains an open sore between these two nuclear giants. A focus for their differences in culture, faith, and territorial ambition. And a wound that doesn't look like it will be healing anytime soon.